Great to see you. You know, one of the things that COVID has really reminded me of, and I just had this thought standing in the back there watching all the different moving parts of just, you know, I've never liked to be called pastor, and that's because we kind of started from this very idea of like we all serve people and we all play a role in community, and all those roles look differently. And you know, some of you are teaching kids, and some of you are, you know, working with government, and some of you are raising kids and wiping butts, and some of you are in county commission stuff right now, and others of you running small businesses, and then you know, some of us do stuff here on Sunday. So it's really a privilege to serve people with you in that way. I'd like to pray to launch this morning, and then we'll just dive in. God, thanks for people and community and the idea of all of this, God. It's frankly a pretty remarkable thing that you would choose to make yourself real, not through an individual, but through a community of people, and this kind of giant homogenous thing of different people with different makeups who it would sure seem would spend a week and a month and a year and a lifetime serving people in a variety of ways, but would also find ways to be together and launch from who you are. So thanks, Lord, for all the moving parts and all the different activities that happen. Thanks for the resources that you entrust us with to serve people and the many different skills that people bring to the table. And God, pray that you just continue to use us to serve people, and that we would steward those opportunities well when they come along, whether that's an opportunity in an elementary school on a Wednesday morning, or that's an opportunity hanging out with a 2-year-old in the middle of the night, or that's an opportunity in a high-leverage government meeting, that you'd embolden us in our opportunities to be extensions of you. We love you. Amen. So, how you doing? What another crazy week, leading into another crazy week. Turns out that there's lots of crazy weeks. So, if you've not been with us these last several weeks or going all the way to Christmas Eve, just by way of quick review, for those of you who have, or even especially if you haven't, we've been exploring this question of what if confusion plus attention equals growth, which is this way of saying that if we can allow that oftentimes those most confused states are among the most difficult and the times where we suffer the most, could we also allow that in those moments we also could anticipate breakthrough, that when we look at our own personal lives, when we look at our spiritual lives, when we look at our best business ideas, when we look at those culture shifts in our family or our extended family, the difficult thing is oftentimes they're born of these times when we're just stuck. And so part of what we're trying to explore in this series, and obviously this is coming from the perspective of a type A control freak with a strong orientation towards the future, but the question becomes, how do we not just like punch confusion in the nose? How do we get better at catching it in the moment, which really would mean not just catching it, but finding God in the moment, and not just finding God in the story when the story's been written, but finding God in the midst of the story. And my prayer, and I say this sincerely because you know, I'm working on not just being a trope that is so easy to use, but my prayer for this community this week was that as we move through and perhaps emerge from COVID, that part of what we're beginning to see is how that's true with COVID. That one of the things I want to explore around Easter is this idea that in kind of a clearing of the temple kind of way, that COVID has torn everything about culture. Almost every routine we have, every institution, most businesses, especially the church, it's torn it down to the studs, like the sheetrock's gone. In many ways, we have to rewire and plumb the thing. But my prayer is that you also would begin to, and I don't mean this in a patronizing way, but just in a stewardship way, begin to identify the like, okay, but as we rebuild, we learned this, I learned this value will be brought with me. That, I think, is the work of the season. And I heard this great story this week that frankly also kind of speaks to some culture stuff around here. I was talking to my friend who lives in Gig Harbor, Washington, and he was telling me that in the early days of COVID there, he's a retired Navy chaplain. I'm going to guess he's in his late 60s, early 70s. But in the early seasons of COVID, one of the things, in order to attend church, they had to register online. And I think that was partially a government mandate so that they could do contract tracing more efficiently, and part of it was just to help the church. And they had the luxury of having these portable seats, so they didn't have to waste all these seats because they could kind of build rows that were distanced. And so what happened from that was you would show up to church and you would already have your seats kind of put in place, and they would be distanced, kind of like you were going to a park or something. We've all seen those types of photos from everybody else. But he said, and here's a guy who's paid a lot of attention to Jesus for most of his life, what he's observed is there's a new dynamic that's forming from that, and that is even in his own family unit, his son also lives in the area, and there's a couple other couples that, like many of us, they just chose, like, we're not going to distance from these people despite the risks of this season. And so what they were invited to start doing was registering for their seats together, so that they weren't showing up with 4 groups of 2, they were showing up with 1 group of 8, which of course helps the church win. In fact, he was telling me their community is now pushing to like 2/3 of attendance potential because, again, as Alex taught us on Christmas Eve, the more we have larger groups, the better. And they're not compromising. It's not like, hey, let's just play fast and loose. It's just going like, hey, we watch football together on Sunday anyway, so let's sit together at church. But then he said, and this is the part that kind of made me leap and was an example to me of this whole COVID thing. He said, now what's happening is there's this culture forming in friendships where, like on Friday or Saturday, you've got friends texting friends going, hey, are you going to church this weekend? And then there's this conversation of like, hey, which service are you going to? And who's getting there first to save seats, which could become a disaster as well. But there's this whole thing that's happening where now you've got people who have reimagined that church doesn't have to just be this like single household experience, but that we kind of stand with and next to the people that we're sharing life with on some of the deeper levels. And I was telling Hannah about that in our meeting this week, and she said, that reminds me of college. She said, in college, you never went to church alone. There was always these chat things that happened over the weekend of who's going and what service you're going to and who's driving. And I just thought it was so appropriate. She said, in college, you never went to church alone. You always went together. And then it's like you graduate and get married, and suddenly you're just supposed to do everything with just that person. And I don't think that's an indictment of Scott. I think we all know Scott and go, he's remarkable. But just this, for me, I don't know about you, but one of the things that's emerging from COVID is this realization of like, we all get to pay our fee and make our decision on the extent to which life is about people, but man, it's a cool example. And frankly, kind of a shameless advertisement, I suppose, of going, man, the extent to which that culture happened here, I think we would all win, and especially we would win because, again, being honest, we could get more people here. So that's this example, and I'm hoping this begins to happen, and I'm hoping this series is kind of giving value to that. The question as we build in this series, and Justin's going to speak next week, don't miss that. He's got such good things to say, but my last contribution is around this question of how do we develop a healthy relationship with the future? And I'm not suggesting that I'm going to say anything this morning that you probably haven't thought about. You can throw that one up there, Jack. But just this, again, from my kind of projected personality type and disposition, for me, where I struggle with these conversations about surrender, and when I struggle, we started the series by talking about what happens if we just pray every day, Lord, your kingdom come, your will be done, and what if part of our transformation isn't in our kind of frontal control, but happens behind the scenes with God? And then last week, we explored this idea of centering prayer, which is this unique version of Christian meditation where, again, we're building these surrender muscles. And for me, a lot of that kind of grates against the very core of who I am because the very best parts of me and the very worst parts of me care deeply about the future. And so it raises these questions of, okay, so how do we live this way and still care deeply about the future? So some of you were like, you don't. Like there's a room full of people, and we could probably on some level split us on this spectrum because some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. Your favorite part of a vacation is planning the vacation. Your favorite part of any kind of project is laying the project out. You had more fun registering for school than you did going to school. And like, I'm with you. And others of you were like, you need to enjoy the moment. And I'm kind of with you, though I would like to point out the only reason you can do that is because the rest of us were planning for the future. Like, but still, how do we do this? And here's where the question happened for me is this really has become, for me, the narrative that I've tried to explore and experience COVID with and lead through, and I'm repeating to myself at least once a day within even thinking about Narrate. I'm really trying to be honest about this, confused but paying attention. And so what happened to me, and it kind of gives the background of this art, was last September and October, some of you may remember that a gal whose name is Leah, that's the artist in that video, she had her art in 10 Mile, which is a brewery down on the Gulch. And it's awesome. I just loved it from the very beginning. And it was a reminder to me of art, because I'd walk in there and go, isn't this amazing? And some people would go, yes, and someone would go, yeah, it's all right. Because my bias is like, show me a picture of a mountain, and I'm like, eh. And like, show me a picture of a herd of elk, and I'm like, like it doesn't do much for me. Show me a picture of a really neat, like old crooked tree, and I'm in. Like, love that stuff. And the background of her art is she's an abstract artist who learned that most people can't appreciate abstract art, so she learned to put something real in it, but it has this very messy but neat vibe. And her husband, who's actually a doctor in town, is also an ultra marathon runner or ultra trail runner. And so he runs our beautiful trail system here and sees all these neat crooked trees, and so he started taking pictures of those, and then she paints them. So I really liked the art, and then what happened is this series started to come together in early October. I had this idea that I pitched to the creative team where I said, I think that art kind of captures it, because there's this messy, what's it becoming, and then this clarity at the end. And some of you have been around long enough to remember, we did a series on Easter where we used this artist from the Archie Bray and did this kind of slow emerging piece of art. And years ago, we filmed Davy painting this incredible picture of the Jesus crucifixion scene and kind of did this slow emerging thing. So I had this idea of we should make contact with her and do art that's kind of that stop motion filming style that kind of catches this confusion and then something's clear at the end. Well, one of the gals on the creative team, Ginny Emery, she said, well, I know Leah. I didn't know Leah's name at the time, so I'll reach out to her. And so she did. A couple days later, we got this email from Ginny saying, hey, I reached out. She's interested. This was like early October. So then we invited her to a creative team meeting, which is the end of the day on Friday. Leah came, and again, she was interested. It was a go. And I left that meeting, and one of the quandaries was, of course, we have a budget for like these, hiring people to produce art for series. That's something that we've all accounted for because of your generosity and our value on art. But of course, we don't have a budget for like commissioned paintings from local artists. And so I had this idea because there's this one tree on top of Mount Ascension that's like my geek tree. Like it's the tree that and it's a natural place to stop on a ride. I caught myself subconsciously saying to the boys towards the end of the season, I was like, hey, when I die, just bring half of my ashes here and half of them to Busch Stadium. And then at the end, they looked at me like, you're a weirdo. But anyway, so I had this idea of like, not only that, but I'm going to have Leah paint this tree, but of course we can't have Narrate pay for that. So I went home and I said to my lovely, gracious, like in-the-moment wife, hey, what if we pay for this painting, then we'll get to keep the painting, and then Narrate pays for the filming? And she was like, yeah, sure, let's do it. So then I shot Leah an email and pitched the whole idea to her, and she's like, yep, let's do it. So then, lots of thens, Lenny and Leah and Tommy and myself met. It was November 7th. I was looking back at the emails this week, and we sat down at one of those picnic tables in the Gulch and kind of talked all this through because we wanted to get Leah to meet Lenny. It's kind of like when you get two of your genius friends to meet and you just watch fireworks, kind of not in a romantic way, but you know what I mean. And so we got them together, and Lenny loved the idea, Leah loved the idea, and so they scheduled the filming for the second Monday after Thanksgiving. And I was walking away from that meeting, like everything went well, everybody's excited, and I hadn't even left the walking mall yet before I had this thought of, what if? Which is like anxiety 101, what if? And what I quickly realized was I so wanted this to happen for us, for myself, that there was instantly this realization of COVID put so many variables on everything. Like what if? What if Leah gets COVID? What if Leah has to get cautious? What if Lenny gets COVID? What if Lenny gets more cautious? And there was all these what ifs, and this anxiety growing inside of me around this idea of this whole thing could blow up. And then, of course, I'm thinking about the January series, and January series artwork is always tricky, stressful for the team because, of course, December is all about Christmas, but 3 days later, we got to have in the can all this art for this other series. So there's just all these what-ifs. And I caught myself, fortunately, and again, I guess I'm a visual thinker. I could go to the spot on the walking mall where I did the centering prayer thing and just went, okay, I don't control this, and actually practiced what's called welcoming prayer, which I put a little bit on your mind map, but I don't have time to get into it this morning, or chose not to have time, and just kind of poof. And then the next day, I was out for a run with my dog, and again I had this question of, man, this whole thing could blow up. In fact, not only could it seems like it probably will with all the different variables and the dominoes and the way they fall. And that's what brought me to this question of how do we do this? How do we sincerely live in the your kingdom come, your will be done, The Son of Man doesn't live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Like, how do we live into that surrender, 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 and yet still have strong commitments to, ideas about the future? I mean, you're carrying them. There's vacations that you hope happen. There's a future for kids that you hope happen. There's jobs that you want and teams that you want to make and people that you want to be with and relationships that you hope for. I mean, on some level, we all live with that. And so how do we live within this tension? And is that something like Jesus and the New Testament thinkers and the 2,000 years of church history since can help us with? I think another way to frame it, and here's the way I've been thinking about it, is like, are we just supposed to avoid it? Like, kind of like flying standby? Have you ever done that? It's the worst for someone like me. It is the worst thing ever, flying standby. Because the idea is pack your bags, get excited, and you might not get to go. In fact, I grew up, my grandpa worked for the airlines. Some of you may be old enough to remember Western Airlines. Back before Delta bought Western Airlines, my grandpa, when more people could make a career working for an airline, that's what my grandpa did. Joined the Navy out of high school, went to work for Western, and that was his future. And so I grew up as a little kid where my dad and my grandpa's kids and his grandkids all had standby rights. And so we would go to Disneyland, we'd go to Mexico, and I still remember the game, and it's like, take deep breaths at him, because it was fortunate we got to go places we didn't, but the game was tricky because there was this whole art form. This was before computer screens and apps, and there wasn't that thing that showed you your priority order. In fact, the way the game was played was like whoever the ticket agent chose, they got to get on the plane. And so I remember there was this whole thing, this whole artwork to like when you approach the ticket agent and how you go about that. And then at just the right time, my dad would go up to the ticket agent. You wanted to make sure they weren't busy, but you also wanted to be the first standby person there. And we would dress to the nines. We didn't have Sunday best. We had like standby flying best. And I can picture, 7-year-old little kid in a full suit. My dad's in a full suit. My mom's in a dress. My sister's in a dress. And I'm not kidding, shameless. My dad would go up to the counter and he'd go, hey, how's it looking today? It look like we're going to make the flight. My name's Steve. And there'd be this whole interaction. And then he'd go, hey, see my family over there? And I'm not kidding. Like, we'd be instructed, you'd kind of stand in a line to where they could see you, and you'd be like holding your Mickey Mouse bag, like, we're going to Disneyland. If you're nice enough to let us. That was kind of the environment. And he'd go, there's my family. Like, do you think we'll get on the flight? And you just stand there and smile. And like, that was the game. And I actually don't remember missing a flight. Turns out that like little 7-year-olds wearing a full suit, like bump old guys not wearing a suit. Then when I was 19, I decided I was going to go back east to visit a friend, and I asked my grandpa for a standby ticket. At that point, he was retired. Delta had bought out Western. He got me a ticket, and I still remember I showed up to the airport in Billings in a full suit. Still don't even know where I got the suit. And my grandpa he knew the guy. He checked me in, did all that kind of stuff, and coached me on, okay, here's what you do when you get to the ticket counter. But then after he talked to the guy, he's like, hey, so apparently they don't want us dressing up anymore. So I'm like, well, I'm committed. I'm wearing a suit, but okay, next time. I made my flights. Next time was 2 years later. Teresa and I were married, broke as most college students were. It was spring of our freshman year, I think. Maybe it was our sophomore year of college. And we kind of tiptoed up to my grandpa, because I think at that point he got 8 standby tickets a year, and we had the audacity, because we were 21 and dumb, to like trump all of his own kids and say, hey, could we have a couple standby tickets to go to San Francisco for spring break? And he got us one from him, and then one of his friends that he'd retired with, he got us one of his. We made it to San Francisco, did our thing in San Francisco. We're leaving San Francisco. This is pre-9/11. Got up to the gate, and now I'm the 21-year-old husband. Like, I got to show my wife, this is how you fly standby, because there's a whole art form to this. And I still remember, I walk up to this lady, and what I wasn't thinking was, this is San Francisco. Like, they don't own Chacos. Like, they only dress nice all the time. And I walked up to the gate, to the ticket counter. We already got to the gate. And I remember doing the hey, my name's Adam, and the flights looked wide open. Are we going to make the flight? How's that all going? And I remember she just stopped, and she looked over the little podium thing, and she looked me up and down, and she's like, who's your wife? And I pointed, and she looks her up and down, and I'm like, this is weird. And she said, you're not dressed appropriately. And she said, in fact, you have open-toe, we were wearing Chacos. She said, you have open-toe shoes on. You are not getting on my airplane wearing those sandals. Well, the context was you never check a bag flying standby, which now nobody checks a bag, period, but then you never did. But the flights were so open, we checked our bag. Again, granted, we're like broke college kids. And what went through my head was now, because we checked our bag, so it's like, oh, now we got to go get a hotel room, and we got to buy shoes, and I don't know how this thing's going to work out. And my wife, after I got out of my panic stupor, was like, why don't we go ask for our bag? So we ran out, we went to the check-in agent. She was the opposite of the ticket agent. She's like, hey, or we said, can we get our bag? And she's like, and she heard the story, and she was kind of like running over the bus with a lady who wouldn't let us get on the plane. She went, she found our bag, she brought it, we put our tennis shoes on, we ran up to the gate, smugly boarded the plane with our closed-toed shoes. A month later, we went to my grandpa's house, and he's like holding this piece of paper. We're like, oh, what's going on? He said, hey, I got a letter. So what's the letter? He said, I got a letter that some of my family, and he wasn't mean about it at all, but it was just this awkward family thing. And he's like, I got a letter saying that someone from my family used one of my passes and they weren't dressed appropriately. And if that happens again, we might lose our privileges. And oh, by the way, my best friend also got that letter. I've never flown standby since. It's a long story to ask this question because I think we can all relate to that. Like sometimes your hand just gets slapped enough and you're like, okay, I'm done thinking about the future. How do we do this? Care deeply, but also live surrendered. And the moment that came to mind for me was, it's actually written by Jesus' brother. In James 4, and here's what actually hit me as I was wrestling through this personally. James says this in chapter 4, he says, come now, you who say, today or tomorrow, we'll go to such and such a town and spend a year there doing business and making money. Yet you do not even know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Let's just stop there for a second. That some of you may recognize as a reference to Ecclesiastes. And the context here is James is addressing the arrogance of some business people who are doing something wrong. What we have to decide is, what are they doing wrong? And listen to the next verse. He says, instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wishes, we will live and do this or that. And I think here's the question, and like I can pose ideas. You have to decide for yourself what it looks like to live this out. But to me, the question becomes, is James here saying that it's inappropriate to plan for the future, to save for the future, to dream about the future, to pack your bags for Disneyland for the future? Is that what he's saying? Or is he somehow making real a way of life that's different than the norm where we do both? Like, is his frustration that they have plans for making money in the future, or is his frustration that they haven't accounted for God in their plans for the future? Like, is he saying, don't do this, or is he kind of saying, but live in this constant reminder that ultimately what you want is what God wants? It reminds me a little bit of Proverbs 3. Again, I think this is one of those, like, just looking at some fundamentals of faith this morning, and if you're brand new to it, then all the better for you. But he says, in Proverbs 3, the author says this, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own insight. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he'll make straight your paths. And for me, within this tension of all of this and trying to honor God with the both end, how do we make plans for Easter and how do we also hold loose our plans, all those types of things. Well, what if it's actually not as complicated, but it's also not that easy? That we live in this tension of, okay, Lord, your kingdom come, your will be done. This is what I want. I'm going to give myself to this. But ultimately, God, I'm going to trust that you're king. Your kingdom come, your will be done is what I ultimately want. I was reading Scott McKnight, who's this Bible scholar. I was reading his commentary on James 3, and the analogy that he makes, he goes back to Genesis and the story of Abram, and he points out that oftentimes we find ourselves at this intersection where we have to choose a couple different options. And I just want to read Genesis 12, because one of the things that we can take for granted is that this wasn't easy for Abram. We don't think that he was a homeless wanderer, but actually he was probably a very affluent person of great power, deeply vested where he was and what he was doing. And yet there's this decisive moment in the history of Judeo-Christian faith where it says this, now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I'll show you. I'll make you a great nation, and I'll bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in all the families of the earth shall be blessed. I mean, this is why we scatter. There's this fundamental belief that we're supposed to be conduits of God's blessing. So Abram went as the Lord told him. And what Scott McKnight said is sometimes in life, we get to choose between great clarity and no confidence in the Lord, or great confidence in the Lord and very little clarity. And I think the way he said it, in those moments, it's better to be like Abram than it is like the merchants in James 4. And yet I think we can also all see that sometimes it's both. Sometimes we get the opportunity to go, Lord, I can kind of see the future clearly, and therefore all the more difficult is it to go, and yet, Lord, I want confidence in you more than I want control over the future. I think one of the other things he said is your need to control the future actually doesn't have any impact on what it looks like. And so for me, as we're thinking about this, that's just this returning to this refrain. You can go to that next slide, Jack. Thank you. You know, when I was maybe you've been to the Middle East. I've been to Israel a couple times, and I remember one of the things that both our Jewish and English guides would say often was, if the Lord wills, if the Lord wills. Tomorrow we're going to Capernaum, if the Lord wills. This afternoon we're going to Masada, if the Lord wills. And it kind of ticked me off. It felt like a little bit of a trope to me. It's like the parenting equivalent of maybe. Like, you're holding all the power. But the more I've experienced COVID and what this season has done and its disruptions, and looking at texts like James, and then even looking at the life of Christ, where Jesus, if you follow the narrative in the Gospels, he often had plans of places to go and people to see, and yet oftentimes his plans deviated. The Gospel of Luke is around one long narrative about Jesus' desire to get to Jerusalem, and yet all the interludes that happened along the way. It's just got me thinking that this whole, if the Lord wills it, is probably not a trope so much as it's an indication of incredible spiritual discipline and maturity. That this living life in the tension of the two, and maybe one of the grand opportunities of COVID, unlike anything most of us have ever experienced in life, is this realization of God invites us to make faith very tangible, because every plan we have for the future and every hope and desire that we either consciously or even subconsciously hold, we get to choose how tightly we hold that. And so as we think about surrender and confusion, I guess the question I wanted to leave you with is what's the circumstance where God, he wants to honor your desire to figure out what business looks like on the other side of this. He wants to honor your desire to figure out how to more effectively educate kids in this season. He wants to honor your desire as a parent in this season. And he's inviting you to be confused. To simultaneously say, I just don't know. I've never thought about something so much and so clearly not had a simple answer to the problem. And what if that point is a point where Jesus often meets people, where faith becomes tangible, where Jesus says things like, why do you worry about your life? Look at the lilies, look at the animals. In fact, instead, why don't you seek first my kingdom and my way of doing things, and just trust, while also working really hard, that I'll be faithful to you. In fact, what if one of the invitations of COVID is that faith has gone from this intellectual thing that we argue about in academic circles to this very everyday thing of what does it look like to live life in the conscious, chosen dependence of a God that we can't always predict. It's a reminder to me that the gospel is not where do you go when you die. It includes that, but that the gospel is Jesus is king, and the grand invitation from Jesus isn't I'll protect you from suffering. The grand invitation of Jesus is I'll walk with you through said suffering and everything else in between. So this morning, if you're brand new to exploring faith, man, we have a great staff that would love to have that conversation, and you probably came with somebody who's just as good at that conversation as any one of us would be. And if there's anything we can do to help you explore, we'd love to do that. And for those of you who stepped in looking for a faith boost, what's the tangible area where God's inviting you to add to all the wants and desires, if the Lord wills, if the Lord wills? And what does it look like to live that consistently within life and leadership. Let me pray for you, God. Lord, praying for my friends in this community and the ways that you equip us to serve people and put you on display. And God, we recognize that that's often not going to be through our perfection, but through our repentance and our screwing up and circling back. And Lord, just pray for every relationship represented in this room, be it at home or in a neighborhood or in a workplace, whether it's young parents buried in diapers or leaders who have never faced things like this and everything in between. God, pray that you'd help us lead with confidence and high buy-in, high engagement, and yet also walk through life with you in such a way that we don't have to have things go our way. In fact, that we have the skill of just reading the moment when you're inviting us to defer to you. We love you, God. Amen.
If you would like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook and Instagram.